What's up, everybody? Matt Kajeski here, back again with the Stokastic channel. And today we are talking college football DFS. The week 5 main slate, we're talking Saturday, 13 games up, 13 games down. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Prize Picks. Prize Picks offers daily prop-based contests where you make lineups of player props, up to 5 player props in a lineup where you can 10 extra entry fee. No sharks, no optimizers, no mass entries, and Prize Picks lets you do this across sports. If you click the link in the video description below, you're going to get 1 free month of Stokastic plus Platinum and up to a $100 match deposit bonus when you sign up and make your first deposit with Prize Picks. So make sure to check out Prize Picks today. All right, diving into the slate, we'll bring you to our player usage tool. DraftKings only today for the video, I guess. FanDuel still doesn't have their slate up as of Thursday afternoon. Come on, FanDuel. But we'll talk DraftKings. Up at the top, you're going to see a lot of game environment data, team data. If you have questions on that, make sure to leave a comment. We've discussed it a lot in previous videos, so I won't take the time today. And we'll dive into the first matchup. It is Michigan taking on Iowa. Michigan is an 11-point favorite. Sorry, it says minus 11 on both sides. It should just be Michigan minus 11. I'll clear this up. Occasionally, this happens early in the week when we try to pump these out. But Michigan's the favorite. Implied team total 26.5. It's a really low-scoring game environment, 42 points. J.J. McCarthy is the quarterback for Michigan. Total, he's at 6,500 here. Fairly underwhelming in his first competitive game last week. Not really showing off his mobility either, which was a staple of the J.J. McCarthy gadget usage last year. But we know it's there. With him, it's basically a bet on talent and Michigan exceeding their team total of 26.5 because it's not great. And it's not a great environment to really target any of these guys, J.J. McCarthy included. We'll talk a lot of quarterbacks today. There's just better price-adjusted plays. But for tournaments, you could maybe take a shot on the upside. In the backfield, Blake Corum's still playable. We don't know the status of Donovan Edwards yet. It looks like he's trending towards playing, but we don't know anything definitively. And Corum handled 29 carries in their last game. An absolutely absurd workload on the ground. Over 200 yards rushing. Corum has a lot of upside regardless, but finally playing in competitive games, at the very least, he'll be in a 50-50 timeshare and a run-heavy offense with Donovan Edwards. And we just saw last week there's upside for much, much more, so we should be considering Corum. Without Eric All in the lineup, tight end Luke Schoonmaker saw 8 targets. It led the team. Crazy enough, he's second on the team in receiving yards. More or less just a surprise. I don't think you're really taking a strong stance on Schoonmaker, but he's cheap if you want to dart throw down there. He plays almost every snap now that All is out. The 3 main receivers were Ronnie Bell, Cornelius Johnson. Roman Wilson was just behind them. And then you get into the timeshares with like Angel Anthony and some of the gadget players. I'm still trying to get to Bell or Cornelius if possible. Because of price, Cornelius is probably the number 1. But overall, this is a lackluster game environment. And the same can be said on the Iowa side, where you've got Petrus at 4,900. I don't care what his price is. You're going to have to pay me money if I'm ever going to play Petrus. He's not mobile. He's not a good passer. And this offense is essentially inept with him under center. So going to the running back position, it's essentially just a full timeshare at this point. Now that they have a full complement of healthy players, you're seeing all of Gavin Williams, LaShawn Williams, Caleb Johnson actually led the team in carries last week. I have no idea where it's going to go, and I honestly don't really care that much just because they've been so inefficient, and that doesn't really project to change anytime soon. So not loving this Iowa rushing attack, and the same can be said for receiver. Because Petrus is so bad, you're probably not considering any of these guys. Sam Laporta, Arlen Bruce, they would be the 2. Maybe you could get to a contrarian Nico Reganey who popped up for a 90% route share, but this is a really bad team. Second, we have Texas Tech taking on Kansas State. Both teams fresh off some upsets. Texas Tech over Texas, Kansas State over Oklahoma. The spread here is 8 points in favor of Kansas State, the home team, 57.5 total. Texas Tech is running the Zach Kittley offense. As you can see at the top, they're incredibly fast and very pass-heavy, which has benefited Donovan Smith. He's been erratic to start the year. He has really good games and then really bad games. And they haven't always made a lot of sense. Prior to last week, Donovan Smith was, he had a lot of interceptions, but his turnover-worthy plays weren't there. Last week, he goes for 300 yards and doesn't throw any interceptions, but he actually had more turnover-worthy plays than big-time throws. So Donovan Smith, he's dicey at 7,200, somewhat mobile. 279 yards per game on 41 attempts. The volume's certainly there. The worry is Kansas State plays relatively slow and run heavy, and they generally depress opposing play volume. Now, they have been beat over the top, and Dylan Gabriel had a great game against them, but Donovan Smith, he's in your GPP category. Running backs up your timeshare between Taj Brooks and Sir Roderick Thompson. I don't think you're playing any of those guys at this point. Maybe just a Sir Roderick in tournaments, but there's better plays, in my opinion. At receiver, Miles Price and Jaron Bradley are the top two guys, averaging 8 targets and 7.8 targets per game. Price leads the team in receiving, 266 yards for him. That's 66.5 per game. He's at 5,400. Jaron Bradley, 5K flat. These are both appropriate prices for them. And beyond that, it gets a little difficult. They actually changed their receiving rotation a bit here. Nehemiah Martinez had been the wide receiver 3 for a little bit here. So had Louis Fungi. This has changed. If you look at their route rate from their most recent game, Fungi went down to 7%. Nehemiah Martinez went down to 32%. That coincided with some increases from other players. J.J. Sparkman jumped to 73% routes, and Brady Boyd was at 40%. He's been kind of in that range through the last 2 games, but the biggest surprise, J.J. Sparkman at 73%. That is big for him, especially if he's going to continue playing that much. 4 targets. He's the stone man. So I'm definitely going to be looking at some J.J. Sparkman this week just because of that route increase. Kansas State. Adrian Martinez, the huge game, over 100 yards. He's still only averaging 133 through the air. A little narrative-y, but it really does look like Kansas State just finally opened up their offense after keeping the reins on in non-con. They did not show much. They weren't throwing downfield. They finally did in their last game. Now, we know Adrian is very mobile. This team has a implied team total north of 30 points here, and he showed some upside as a passer. I think he's in play. He actually projects fairly well in the back end because this team total is so high. I think there's some reasons to play some contrarian Adrian Martinez. I've been on this throughout the year with varying success, a lot of success last week, no success before that, but that's what makes him suitable for tournaments. Deuce Vaughn, certainly playable here. He still has a near 17% target share. He's averaging 25.5 touches per game, over 100 yards on the ground. Solid through the air. He's averaging another 11 yards there. Not quite the same efficiency we saw from him back when he was with, the previous signal callers in the previous regime. Skylar Thompson was very solid to Deuce Vaughn, but he still has a solid workload overall. I'll be playing Deuce Vaughn at this lower price. The receivers, they're not always involved. It kind of depends on game script for them, but Phillip Brooks and Malik Knowles are the top 2. Cade Warner's the 3. They haven't used a consistent tight end. It's actually been split 50-50 between Ben Sano and Sammy Wheeler. I think at their prices, Malik Knowles makes the most sense. He leads the team in receiving yards, and he's just a bit cheaper than Brooks, but this is a GPP play all the way. Not going to be playing a lot of these guys. Purdue, Minnesota. This is a 12.5-point spread in favor of the Gophers, a 52 total. Vegas and bookmakers are respecting the Gophers finally, and it makes sense. Purdue, the status of Aiden O'Connell's up in the air. He has a rib injury, so I'm optimistic he plays, averaging 333 passing yards per game, not mobile whatsoever, so he is reliant on the passing. Minnesota hasn't played anybody, and they haven't played anybody that's really going to air it out. Michigan State, they are what they are, but they're struggling right now, and then they played some inept teams like New Mexico State. It's hard to evaluate them. Purdue's going to stress them in ways they haven't been stressed this year with their 64.5% pass rate, 76 plays per game. If O'Connell plays, I will be using him in some contrarian stacks. Even though he doesn't project that well, he has that kind of upside. He's easy to stack too. Charlie Jones is cheap on this slate. This guy was 8K a couple slates ago. 6.4 is a value, even in a tough matchup. He's averaging 133 yards per game. You just play Charlie Jones when it makes sense. Payne Durham's their tight end, second most targeted receiver, only 37 yards per game for him. They've also changed their routes a little bit here for Purdue, so I want to take you behind the curtain and talk through them a little bit. Jones and Payne Durham are locked into their roles. Charlie Jones Tyrone Tracy, getting the Iowa transfers confused here. Tyrone Tracy had previously been around 20% of the routes. That jumped to 70% last week, and TJ Sheffield was up at 81%. That came at the expense of Deion Burks and Mershawn Rice. I think you can use some contrarian Tyrone Tracy and TJ Sheffield this week in Purdue stacks if you would like. Neither of whom are particularly expensive, particularly TJ Sheffield. $3,200 for him. There's a chance you get some really cheap options in this pass game. The backfield's a timeshare. King Doru may return after his 2-game absence. That would render things really difficult to target here. Dylan Downing has been the lead back of a timeshare that also features Devin Maccabee. Tough to play Purdue backs right now. In the pass game for Minnesota, we have Tanner Morgan game managing his way to victory after victory, somehow averaging 221.5 yards in just 20 attempts. The efficiency's been good now that he's been reunited with his old OC, Kirk Shiraka. Decent mobility, 52 yards. Like, as long as he's not getting negative yards, like Tanner Morgan having 52 yards on the ground is pretty good. The issue is volume, and it's going to be volume all the way through. So I would rather play some other cheaper quarterbacks than Morgan. Mohamed Ibrahim, the volume hasn't been the same. Now, he has a monstrous workload on the ground. With that said, 9,500 for him, it's not the 30 carry workload we saw at times 2 years ago or early last year before the Achilles. It's been all efficiency, 143 yards. To me, this is a price you're paying for him against a MAC school, him against New Mexico State, not him against Purdue, who's actually played a really good run defense this year. They would need to lay off Potts a little bit and play more Ibrahim for me to be a lot more interested in this price. So we'll continue to monitor this, but right now the tentative lean is if you can find the salary, he's fine, but I'll be looking to some cheaper backs. Potts is a little too expensive, even though he gets 14 touches a game, 4K flat. I mean, it's not the worst. In tournaments, I could see maybe playing a little bit, assuming the role stays consistent. In the receiving room, again, formatting here, we try to get these out as early as possible. Daniel Jackson, the reason his position and salary didn't come up, there's multiple Daniel Jacksons on the slate, so we'll fix that on the back end. He's their wide receiver 3, so is important for him. Overall, Brevin Spanford, Brown Stevens, Dylan Wright, and Daniel Jackson are the top 4 guys to mention. Chris Autman-Bell's injured, out for the year. Brevin Spanford, their tight end, he's averaging 3.8 targets per game. Third leading receiver on the team. He's very cheap. If you think this goes past heavy, I think he's solid. Brown Stevens looks like he's the new wide receiver 1 without Autman-Bell. 6 targets for him, 180 yards in the year. That's now it technically leads the team because Autman-Bell is injured. Then Dylan Wright and Daniel Jackson round things out here. Brown Stevens is a little expensive, but Brevin Spanford is so cheap. I'm not sure I'd be playing Dylan Wright or Daniel Jackson anyway. But overall, you're probably not playing a lot of Minnesota pass catchers. Navy Air Force, it's a game you can more or less just X out. 37.5 total is terrible. Navy is implied for 12 points. Ty Lavatai is not involved enough on the ground, 42 yards per game rushing. That's his average, which leads the team. And then they don't throw enough to really be worthwhile here. 17% throw rate, and they've been getting killed in some games. I'm off Navy entirely. And then for Air Force, I think it comes down to, do you want to play a contrarian Brad Roberts? He has no targets in his career, and the average for him is 100 yards on the ground per game. Is that enough to overcome some other backs that have more receiving upside? Maybe. I think he's going to be contrarian for that reason. I'll probably play a little bit of him. Navy's not good at all. And there's the opportunity here for Brad Roberts to have like 150 yards on 24 carries if it shakes that way. But John Lee Eldridge will be involved. They may be getting back DeAndre Hughes and Dane Kinnaman this week. They haven't been active in a few games now. We'll have to see with Air Force. Hazik Daniels, he's a triple option quarterback like Lavatai. These guys need to be treated as glorified running backs. And with single-digit pass attempts on average, there's just a lot of opportunity costs in targeting an armed force quarterback when you could play another running back or like just a flat-out quarterback in the Superflex too. It's not like you need to lock in Hazik Daniels or Ty Lavatai in those positions. Bama, they're taking on Arkansas, 17.5 point spread, 61 total. Bama has a monstrous total. Bryce Young is really expensive right now for his 257-yard average. That's on 30.5 attempts nearly. However, Bryce Young's played in 1 competitive game and 3 blowouts. The thing I'll say is the competitive game against Texas was concerning. He didn't really get going until the last couple drives of that game, and he has not gotten any help from his receivers. When you look at their yards per route run, they're essentially below or right on the league average, except for Ja'Cory Brooks, which is a huge problem for this team. I mean, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, these receivers aren't walking through that door anytime soon. So either these young receivers need to get better, or the veterans like Jermaine Burton need to play to their recruiting caliber and their transfer profiles, but they have not gotten that. Makes Bryce Young dicey at this price. Like, you're paying nearly 10K for him. The rushing yards, 150 on the ground, it essentially all came on one scramble. He actually had negative rushing yards in his career prior to this season. There's always the upside stacking Bryce Young. We've seen it game in, game out. He's the Heisman winner last year. The total's high. The team total's high. There's just a little more questions than what we saw last year. So I'll be still playing him in GPPs, but for cash games, it's not going to be Bryce Young. The backfield, we haven't got Jahmyr Gibbs bell cow like we thought we were going to. His best game came against Texas, and that was on the back of 9 targets. He does have 19 targets this year. He's the second leading target getter. He's only one behind Trayshawn Holden, but his volume on the ground has actually been bad. He only averages 11 touches per game. And in the competitive game, I mean, it was negative game script throughout, but I thought he would be more involved than he was. They did cut out the Trey Sanders and the Jamarian Millers, but they still involve Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams. That's probably going to be a staple this Alabama team this year. So at 8K, I'd rather pay down for some other options, but Gibbs will have the GPP upside because he can get 10 targets in a game. The wide receivers are really tough to evaluate here because of the non-competitive games, because of the poor play across the board. So just based on the routes, I'm going to blindly assume for now that Trayshawn Holden's the wide receiver 1 alongside Jermaine Burton. I don't know who is going to play more between these two or have a better year overall. I would tentatively bet on Holden because Burton's just been so bad, but they're the 2 receivers on the field the most. From there, you're looking at Kobe Prentice and Ja'Cory Brooks, and the routes have not been consistent between these players. Ja'Cory Brooks, he played more than Prentice in game 2, which I've been looking a lot at. That's the Texas game. But Prentice played more in their last game. Prentice played more in week 1. I think this is a fluid situation. Again, Brooks has been the most efficient on a yards per route run basis, so I'm going to tentatively side with Brooks. When we look at pricing for all of these guys, they're priced right at that point where it's enticing enough. You know, like a 5K Alabama wide receiver 1, if that ends up being Ja'Cory Brooks, like you would want to hit that. But the uncertainty leaves a lot to be desired here. I'll be taking some stabs on Brooks, Burton, Holden, and Prentice, but I'll be focusing most of my attention on Brooks and Holden as the cheaper options here. You can also play Cameron Latu, the tight end. Since he's come back, he's been extremely involved. Latu, last week, his route share was at 73%. It's been at least 73% and more in each of the last 3 games, so he could be a cheaper attachment to Alabama if you're trying to get one. Tough evaluation of Alabama this year, tougher than at any point last year, I will say. Arkansas, they come in off the heartbreaking loss, missing the field goal to lose the game. They actually were pretty efficient against Texas A&M. Kendall Briles got a lot of criticism, rightly so, for passing 19 times with KJ Jefferson, despite averaging over 9 yards per attempt. And KJ Jefferson's been efficient throughout his career now. The problem is volume, but he is involved on the ground, which is positive here. He had 12 design rush attempts in their last game. He has at least 12 in 3 of the 4 games this year. So KJ Jefferson can always be played. And I do have questions about Alabama's defense. We saw Texas exploit them a little bit, and then they've played nobody in the meantime. So KJ, I think, is fine for tournaments. Raheem Sanders is a solid bell cow back for this team. Overall, he has at least 18 touches in every game, but now you're starting to see the return of some other backs. Dominique Johnson made his debut last week. AJ Green carried 9 times. It doesn't look like Raheem Sanders quite has the same role we saw earlier this year. If I am targeting an Arkansas back, it is him for the time being. In the past game, Jaden Hazelwood got banged up a little bit, but we know who's going to be on the field. The top 3 guys are going to be Jaden Hazelwood, Matt Landers, and then tight end Trey Knox. The interesting thing here was Keytron Jackson played ahead of Warren Thompson in that final receiver spot. Targets don't reflect it. Warren Thompson still had 5. Keytron Jackson had 2. But I'll bring you back to route rates again, which we'll continue to do throughout this video. You look at the routes for Arkansas. Keytron Jackson, 83%. Warren Thompson, 42%. Warren Thompson had hit 75% in each of the 3 prior games, so the drop to 42 coinciding directly with Keytron Jackson's ascendance. Something to monitor here. I'm probably just focusing my attention on the top 3, Hazelwood, Landers, and Knox for those of you stacking Arkansas or looking for run backs. Knox and Landers are cheap enough where I would prefer to play them. Oklahoma State taking on Baylor. This is a fun game, 56.5 total, 2.5 point spread in favor of Baylor. Both teams interesting here. Oklahoma State passing a lot more than maybe we expected. 51% pass rate, still up tempo. Spencer Sanders, incredibly mobile, one of the veteran dual threats in this conference. He's averaging over 300 passing yards per game, and we've now seen that in a couple decent matchups. I want to be careful with how I call Arizona State. I don't want to say that's a tough matchup necessarily, even though they are Power 5. But Spencer Sanders has gotten it done against Central Michigan, against Arizona State. And he's 6,500. This is a cheap price for a dual threat who we have a big sample on at this point in his career. He's involved in the design running attack outside of last week. I guess I should say 2 weeks ago. They had a bye last week. Outside of game 3, he had 9 and 12 design rushing attempts, so clearly involved from a design perspective. In the run game, Dominique Richardson, in their game against Arizona State, had 27 carries and 6 targets. This guy could be on a pure bell cow trajectory. Ollie Gordon and Jaden Nixon were relatively uninvolved. They did run a lot of plays in that game, but my goodness, this guy has 33 touch upside in his arsenal. I think we can play some Dominique Richardson because of that, even against a strong Baylor front. And the strength of that Baylor team is up front on defense. In the receiving game, this team is another team where they've messed around with routes a little bit, and I'm going to bring that up just so we can really get some clarity. You'll see the targets on the screen, and we'll circle back to that. But from a route perspective, Oklahoma State, they've really focused their attention on Braden Johnson and Bryson Green. In that Arizona State game, Braden Johnson and Bryson Green 100% of routes. Brennan Presley, 75. John Paul Richardson, 68. And that basically rounds everything out here. All of the players you're seeing on the screen that had rotational roles in other games, they were essentially siphoned out of the offense in favor of those 4, and those were the route rates. Braden Johnson and Bryson Green leading the way here. So when we circle back to targets here, I think that makes some sense seeing Braden Johnson at the top, Bryson Green third. But the pricing doesn't make sense. Brennan Presley, number 1 at 6,900, getting wide receivers 1 and 2, Braden Johnson and Bryson Green at 4.3 and the Stone Min 3K flat. I don't know what happened in pricing, but they got it wrong. And the 2 guys that are actually the wide receiver 1 and 2 are actually priced like the wide receivers 5 and 6. Tough to see here. Jaden Bray might be back. Last thing to note here, he would probably just play a rotational role in week 1 of his return. On the Baylor side, Blake Shapen has been relatively underwhelming. 193 yards per game through the air on 25 attempts, 34 rushing yards. He's not running. So he's your game manager. Probably needs a shootout to be coaxed out of this. Oklahoma State does allow 8.9 yards per pass attempt. So matchup is solid, but volume is a concern in this slow, run-heavy Baylor offense. And what we thought might happen last week actually occurred. Richard Reese, he appears to have taken over the backfield. He now has 19 and 20 carries in back-to-back games. He only has 2 targets on the year, so everything's coming on the run. But he's just been more explosive than Quaylon Jones or either of the Williams. And I think his workload continues. So you're buying $4,900. It's a pretty affordable price on what could be a bell cow back for Baylor this season if his efficiency continues. He has been very good to start the year. 4.9 is a value. Receiver is not really a position I'm looking at on Baylor. Ben Sims, the tight end, leads the way. He missed a game, so averaging 5.3 targets per game. He'd be probably the yardage leader if he hadn't gotten injured. Hal Presley, Seth Jones, Gavin Holmes, Monterey Baldwin, these guys all rotate receivers, so it's tough to play anyone really in this past game at all. Wake Forest, Florida State's a really fun game here. Florida State has a ton of injuries on defense I'm monitoring. That could open things up for Wake Forest. The total in the game is 65, so we're expecting points for sure. 7-point spread in favor of Florida State. They're good this year, and they have been, and they're finally getting the recognition in the spread. But Wake Forest, I mean, they just carved up Clemson's defense. Clemson was supposed to have defensive line advantages. Wake Forest capitalized regardless. Didn't matter. They picked apart that secondary that was banged up. But Sam Hartman, 321 yards per game on 34.5 attempts. Hyper efficient. 33 rush yards on the year. He's not giving you zeros on the ground. You can stack Hartman in any matchup at this point, even as underdogs. The backfield, I'll avoid Justice Ellison, timeshare with Christian Turner. He did get 21 carries in their last game, but he's still only averaging 46 yards per game. Wake Forest is not competent on the ground. These guys are just tournament plays. In the receiving room, A.T. Perry is still the wide receiver 1. He's averaging 8.3 targets per game, 68.3 yards per game. This is something we need to talk about. Wake Forest has moved to a rotation at receiver. The only player who's been relatively unaffected is Perry. It's affected his target share, but his route rate stuck at 80% in the last game. Nobody else was above 62.5%, and that was tight end Blake Whiteheart. Donovan Green, 60%. Jamal Banks, 60%. A.T. Perry, 80%. We'll finish that out. Taylor Morin, 57.5%. Keyshawn Williams, 42.5%. They're rotating 5 wide receivers on the field, and only A.T. Perry's been relatively safe. That is reflected in targets. Jamal Banks popping up for 8 targets. Donovan Green down at 4. Taylor Morin, 4. Keyshawn Williams, 3. The week prior, they all had at least 6. This is going to be back and forth, up and down throughout the year. So looking at pricing, Jamal Banks, DraftKings messed up his price. $3K flat. He's clearly a guy you want to play outside of A.T. Perry, but you're going to get leverage by playing Keyshawn Williams, Donovan Green, Taylor Morin. Everyone's just going to play Jamal Banks. So know that going in. Jamal Banks is the best play because his price is laughable for 15 targets over the last 2 games, but he's rightfully going to be owned. Next team, Florida State, 36 points implied team total. Jordan Travis, not quite showing the same mobility as last year. He had a lower body injury 2 games ago. He'll come back as he gets healthier. He was also knocked out of that game, but Travis has been awesome. 8,800 is a bit to pay for him, but 36 total. He's involved in the ground. He's been excellent as a passer. Again, his passing stats are somewhat depressed by exiting the Louisville game. I still think Travis is a comfortable play in tournaments. The backfield's a 3-way timeshare. Trayshawn Ward, Trey Benson handle most of the groundwork. Lawrence Tawafali plays a lot on 3rd down. These are just tournament plays. In the receiving game, you're looking at Johnny Wilson and Ontario Wilson as your top 2 pass catchers. Johnny Wilson, I think he's the clear priority. If you can get him, 5,500 is fine. Averaging 5.5 targets per game. That's somewhat depressed. His week 1 game, just 2 targets. He's coming off an injury, so I wouldn't be too worried about Johnny Wilson. Ontario should be there too. Route rate's not great for him because they are rotating in Micah Pittman. They're rotating in Kentron Poitier, Malik McClain, Deuce Vaughn, Cameron McDonald's involved as a tight end. They're playing 7 pass catchers. So you're not going to have the best projection on these guys, but if you're stacking for tournaments, I'd be looking at Johnny Wilson or maybe a contrarian Cam McDonald at the tight end spot. Iowa State, Kansas, really fun game. This is not the Kansas of old. Iowa State's a 3-point favorite, 58-point total overall. And this is a bit surprising to me considering how good Kansas has played. Iowa's been a little broken on offense, really inefficient, 5.9 yards per pass attempt. Excuse me, that's allowed. They've been actually good on pass defense. But the ADOT for Deckers has been 6.7. That's the stat we're looking for. They're not throwing the ball downfield with Deckers. And I think for a good reason. He's had a lot of turnover-worthy plays. He's not running the ball, even though he was labeled a dual threat. He has just 10 yards on the ground this year. He's averaging 257 as a passer coming through sheer volume. He has a 55% pass rate, but Deckers questionable at best. Kansas is giving via the pass, though. That's the one redeeming quality here. 88.9 yards per attempt for Kansas's defense through the air. Deckers, if he gets some volume, might be able to take advantage of that. I'm skeptical, but maybe if you want to target the pass game, you just play Xavier Hutchinson, 36% target share, at least 10 targets in every game this year, averaging over 100 yards. These low 8-out targets are going to Hutch, and he's getting 10 of them a game, getting 100 yards. He's solid. Jarrell Brock has a feature back role. It's just a matter of can Kansas take advantage of this and stop a poor rushing attack. Kansas is actually pretty good on the ground, but Jarrell Brock, he's averaging 19.8 touches per game, 87.5 yards, 88 yards on the ground. Pretty active as a pass catcher. He's their 3rd leading target getter. I think in contrarian builds, you could play him. At the end of the day, he's still favored, and Kansas defense doesn't scare you. They're also not really using Cartevious Norton, Deion Silas, or Eli Sanders at this point. Kansas, Jalen Daniels, his price is incorrect again. 7K is too cheap. He has 326 rushing yards through 4 games. He's averaging nearly 225 as a passer. He has designed rushing attempt counts of 12, 10, and 11. The guy has 44 carries overall. 36 of them have been designed. He has 7 scrambles, and then he's taken 1 sack. Jalen Daniels is incredibly involved on the ground. He's still playable at this price. The backfield, you're not going to get explosive plays from Daniel Highshaw every single time he catches the ball, but my goodness, got to credit him when it's due. That was a solid play by Highshaw. It's a 3-way committee between Highshaw, Neal, and whatever Jaden Daniels gives you on the ground. The receiving room is also a committee. You're seeing Lawrence Arnold, Luke Grimm, Quentin Skinner play the most, but players like Trevor Cardell, Tanaka Scott, the tight ends, Jared Casey, Mason Fairchild, they're involved. And that's why the target share for Arnold and Grimm is tied at 21% for the team lead. and no receivers averaging more than 48.5 receiving yards per game, It's tough to play Kansas pass catchers. Maryland taking on Michigan State, 7.5 point spread in favor of Maryland, 60 total overall, so this is very good. Michigan State's been broken. Peyton Thorne averaging 225 passing yards, 31 rushing yards. He has backdoored his way to a couple good games. We saw that against Washington, but you're just hoping the upside's still there with him. I mean, we saw it multiple times last year. He can run a little bit. Jaden Reed looks like he's healthier. He returned. He saw 5 targets in their last game. Keon Coleman's actually really stepped up in the absence of Reed when that's happened. So I don't know. Basically, they've tried to slam their running backs into the back of the offensive line early in games, failed, and then needed to play from behind and ended up losing. Berger only 4 carries, Broussard only 6 carries in the last game. Maybe they're making that realization. I'm not playing a Michigan State back, but I'll look at Jaden Reed at a bounce back. I am concerned that Keon Coleman's been so good in his absence. He's averaging 9 targets per game, 65 yards. He's been the wide receiver 1 this year over Reed when Reed has been healthy. Keon Coleman's the better play right now at 4,200. Reed's still playable in tournaments because we know the upside with him, but Keon Coleman's just been better. And then beyond that, it's a rotation. You're going to see some combination of Trey Mosley, the tight ends, Daniel Barker, Tyler Hunt, Jeremy Bernard. These guys are rotating in the final pass catching spots. I'll stick with Keon Coleman and Jaden Reed. For Maryland, Tagovailoa got banged up in their last game. He says he's going to play here. Maryland has been pass heavier. I'll pull you back to the pass rate. I mean, they've been run heavier. It's just a 53% pass rate, and they're playing slower, 65 plays per game. They're running the ball a lot this year, and that's affected Tagovailoa's bottom line. Tagovailoa is semi-mobile, but he was highly dependent on those 300-yard games last year. He now has 29.5 attempts per game. Part of that because he got knocked out of the last one, and they also played some cupcakes, but it's still not the volume we thought they would see, and that is stemmed through the pass catchers. It's not only slightly more run-heavy, but it's not condensed. Raheem Jarrett got knocked out of their last game. He's questionable, but you're not seeing consistent routes from Jay Sean Jones, Dante Demas, Jacob Copeland, Ty Felton, tight end CJ Dippery are all involved, and they're all rotating on and off the field. If I'm playing any of them, it's still probably Dante Demas, but he's gotten real risky. 11.5%, 12% target share is not good. Jay Sean Jones at 14%. I think I'm passing on the Maryland pass game for the first time in years now, but it might be time. Unless Jarrett's out and this condenses, it's been brutal. The backfield, Roman Hemby, he might be a better play just straight up than some of these guys. Now, Hemby, he has 11 targets on the year. That's the same as tight end CJ Dippery. It's 2 behind Jacob Copeland, 4 behind Dante Demas. I mean, he's involved enough to target. I think Hemby, if they can run on this team, this Michigan State team, which other teams have, you could be looking at a pretty decent spot for him. He's now touched the ball 20 and 19 times in back-to-back games. He'll be contrarian at the very least. Going forward, we've got, let's see here, 4 games left. A&M, Mississippi State. A&M, they just lost Aeneas Smith. That's tough. 3.5 point underdogs to Mississippi State. 44.5 total, so we're not expecting points here. And Max Johnson, he's been a game manager. The stats are warped by the timeshare quarterback, but he is somewhat mobile. You question the offensive scheme. You now question not having Aeneas Smith. I don't know. You're probably just playing Devin A-Chain or moving on. A-Chain's their most efficient player without a doubt. He touched the ball 23 times in the last game. He actually has 23 touches in back-to-back games, averaging 89 yards in the ground as a receiver. He's averaging another 18. Even in tough matchups, he's solid. Without Aeneas Smith, Evan Stewart should be the clear wide receiver 1. He's their freshman, 141 yards this year. He's gotten at least 7 targets in every game he's played, missed week 3 because of a suspension. I would expect some combination of Chase Lane, Yul Keith Brown, Chris Marshall, or Moose Muhammad to take up what's left. They've rotated these guys, so it's not clear who's going to play between them. I will be making some bets. Moose Muhammad might be one. You know, it might just be easier to tell you their routes from their last game. So we'll do that. And hopefully you're not as confused as me. But it was Aeneas Smith. He vacates 80% of the routes from last week. Evan Stewart's at 100. He's locked in. Chase Lane, single digits in routes. Yul Keith Brown, 23% routes. Chris Marshall, 35%. Moose Muhammad, 71. So, Moose Muhammad might be the guy I want to target, right? Well, on the year, his route rate's 23%. it's buoyed by this game he had last week with 71% of the routes. For tournaments, I might look at him, but it's probably just Evan Stewart or bust. Mississippi State. Jaquavius Marks expected to play here. That's the big news in the backfield. That's a 50-50 timeshare between him and Dylan Johnson. Will Rogers continues to backdoor his way to 300 yards passing based on the Mike Leach air raid. He's not mobile whatsoever, so he is reliant on that to get there. And I'll tell you right now, in this low total game, he does not project for 300 yards. Could easily get there, but all that to say, this is not your locked-in affair that it had been in other matchups. It's a tough game environment for Will Rogers. If you're playing anyone in the pass game, for me, it is either Caleb Ducking, wide receiver 1, expensive Rufus Harvey, or I'll go all the way down and play Austin Williams. But right now, the best combination of price and upside is Caleb Ducking. He averages 6.8 targets per game. He leads the team in receiving. Routes are there for him. They're not there for every other player. So like Rufus Harvey, Ra Thomas, Lydrick Griffin, Jaden Wiley, Jameer Calvin, Austin Williams, they're all good and they're all rotating. So I think this is a spot where you're probably just mixing and matching where you can, but I think Ducking is the best play to get to. If I'm not playing Ducking, I might just go down and play Lydrick, Jaden Wiley, and Calvin. Maybe Austin Williams too is the cheaper attachments to this offense. I guess I should read your routes. We'll do that quick before we move on, just so you have them. A lot of people ask for them. All right, last game for Mississippi State. Well, let's do the route rates on the year. Rufus Harvey, 49%. Caleb Ducking, 75%. Ra Thomas, 46%. Lydrick Griffin, 44%. Jaden Wiley, 40%. Jameer Calvin, 36%. Austin Williams, 50%. So these numbers suggest Austin Williams might be the wide receiver 2 from a sheer route perspective, but Ducking, the clear wide receiver 1. All right, 3 games left. Illinois, Wisconsin, not much to see here. 42.5 total, 7-point spread in favor of Wisconsin. For Illinois, it's basically, do you want to play Chase Brown? And I do a little bit. Leads the league in rushing, averaging 149 yards per game. This is the toughest matchup he's faced this year, so that is a question. In the receiving game, Isaiah Williams has a really low ADOT, but he has a 30% target share, 38 targets on the year, 65 yards per game. Pat Bryant's essentially averaging the same yards on 18 targets. He has 20 fewer targets, but Bryant's been hyper efficient. You're still probably not playing either, and you're not playing DeVito at quarterback. For Wisconsin, you're not playing Mertz, and you're not playing pass catchers, so can you play Braylon Allen? He's really expensive for this matchup here, and he hasn't been seeing the same workload he saw last year. Ches Malusi's averaging 10 touches per game. Braylon's only at 19.5. Like, what is going on here? Last week, that did change a little bit. Braylon, 26 touches. Ches Malusi came in with just 4. So perhaps the guard has changed and Braylon is back to his ways, but risky proposition right now. I'll still play Braylon in some tournament lineups. Oklahoma TCU, sneaky fun game here. 6.5-point spread in favor of OU. 68.5 total, so we got to stack this. Dylan Gabriel, 272 yards per game. It would be higher if it weren't for blowouts. This guy should be a 300-yard passing average per game. He's also been more mobile than he was at UCF, so you like to see that. He's giving you a sprinkle on the ground. Gabriel's my preferred expensive quarterback. I would rather play Gabriel than Bryce Young, but ultimately I think I'll be going away from both of them. Eric Gray's in a timeshare with Marcus Major. It's pretty clear that it's a 1A, 1B situation, but Gray's still been efficient 100 yards per game. It's going to be tougher sledding against TCU for him, I think. Receiving game, love Marvin Mims. This dude's a stud. Wish he would get more target volume, just 21% of the targets. My hope is that this increases in more competitive games, which it has. 7 targets in their last game. He's averaging nearly 100 yards per game. That should continue to be high. Jaleel Farouk tied him in targets. He's 5K. Tight end Braden Willis is 4K. Theo Weiss, kind of a middling wide receiver 2. He's at 5.8. These are your every down players. And you'll see Drake Stoops on occasion, but I'm trying to play Mims, Braden Willis, or Jaleel Farouk for the most part for this team. TCU, Max Dugan's the starter. Chandler Morris is healthy, so the leash might not be the longest, but Dugan's going to start. His stats are warped by the timeshare to begin the year. Chandler Morris started the first game. Jackson is like a spark plug in the ground game. He's not really a threat to pass, but you might see a wildcat snap from him here or there. Dugan averages 230 yards per game, one over 300 yards against SMU. OU's pass defense has been suspect. Again, their inflated stats come because of competition. Kansas State gutted them. Kansas State gutted them with Adrian Martinez on the ground. Dugan can run. He's a solid play at 6,700. Kendry Miller, we saw the backfield condense a little bit with the game. Previously, against cupcake opponents, they hadn't used Kendry Miller to his full capabilities, but 17 touches in their last game. Explosive playmaker. He's too cheap. I'll be playing Kendry Miller in tournaments. The only other running back to touch the ball was Amari DeMarcado. Trent Beatty and Amani Bailey each had a target, but they did not touch the ball on the ground. In the receiving game, people might be coaxed into playing Darius Davis after the long catch and score. It came on a shuffle pass. It was essentially a handoff. And he only had he didn't even play on 30% of the routes. So I'd be concerned with Davis. He was behind Tay Barber in routes. He was behind Savion Williams and Quentin Johnston. Based on the routes run, it's still Quentin Johnston and Savion Williams as the top two receivers, which is scary because neither of them have cracked 100 yards this year total. Darius Davis, Jordan Hudson, and Tay Barber all have. The routes don't reflect this, though. I'll continue to buy on Johnston and Savion Williams at least for another week, hoping this normalizes. And we've got Kentucky taking on Mississippi to close this out. 6.5 point spread in favor of Ole Miss, 54.5 total. Kentucky's offense has been brutal at times. Will Levis is averaging 295.8 passing yards per game through weak opponents. Only 29 pass attempts per game. This is going to regress. He's taken a ton of sacks too. Previously considered a dual threat. Negative 37 rushing yards for Will Levis. Yikes. They're also getting back Chris Rodriguez this week, which is huge because their run game has been broken. I would immediately expect him to play over Cavassier Smoke and Lavelle Wright. This should be a timeshare to some degree, at least till Chris Rodriguez gets his bearings, but Chris Rodriguez should be the RB1 when it's all said and done. Wide receiver, it's Tavion Robinson 2, Tavion Robinson 1, Dane Key 2, Barian Brown 3. They're the clear leaders in receiving yards. 349 for Tavion, that's 87 per game. 241 for Dane, that's 60 per game. And 201 for Barian, that's 50 per game. Those are the guys you're targeting if you're playing anyone in this pass-catching core. Ole Miss is tricky. They haven't played anybody super good. They played Troy and Georgia Tech, but Jackson Dart, he's mobile, 201 yards in the ground, averaging 174. That's going to go up when he's not splitting time with Luke Altmaier, which he won't going forward. I think he's playable in tournaments. He's expensive. I'd rather play some other guys in his range, but for tournaments, I think you can get to him. The backfield's tough. Ulysses Bentley's hurt. Zach Evans is hurt. Zach Evans is a hip pointer. I don't know if he's going to play. That could leave Quinshawn Judkins as a bell cow back. Now, Judkins is involved regardless. He's their star freshman. He's averaging over 100 yards per game. He saw 28 carries last week. That was the result of injury, but we know he has that upside now. Previously, he'd been in a near 50-50 timeshare. It was like a 60-40 split with Evans. Judkins is playable regardless, and he would become the best price-adjusted play on the slate if Evans misses this game. I think you can play Judkins regardless. In the past game, they may be getting back Jalen Robinson. Michael Trigg has been the most active in terms of routes, but the yards have not been there for Trigg. They've gone to Heath and Mingo. Mingo is the true wide receiver one. He is at 18 targets. Heath's at 19. I think Heath is maybe a better price-adjusted play, but overall, I'll be looking at Trigg as a cheap GPP option at 3,400. Jalen Robinson's just expensive at 7,500 for a guy with his potential timeshare at receiver overall. But I'll leave you guys there for the slate today. Let me know in the comment section what you think of the plays. If there's anyone you like, anyone you don't like, anyone I miss, sometimes that happens. And I'll correct those errors that you saw throughout the video. There's a couple of them. And if you see any, just let me know. Otherwise, hit the thumbs up button on the way out. Leave a comment. You can hit me up on Twitter. My name is Matt Gajeski on Twitter at Matt_Gajeski. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you again next time.